Hi and welcome to Boston Media Theory. My name's Marcus Breen and this is a program where we look at people who are working in and around media and, well, areas of communication in Boston, and indeed who might be passing through Boston in, well, not a totally temporary way, but certainly who make a contribution while they're moving through the city. And so today I'm delighted to have Louis de Paor from the National University of Ireland at Galway, correct?
That's it exactly, Marcus.
That's it exactly, all right. Louis and I met a long time ago in another world, another hemisphere in Australia, and so it's been wonderful to see Louis again in Boston. And the point of our conversation is to discuss Ireland, but that's not going to get us very far. So the specifics of Ireland being your interest and work as a poet, your interest and work in the question of the relationship between literature, poetry, if you like, and a national development question, questions of independence and politics, all of which are usefully intertwined and need to be untwined, untangled in some way, and made explicit so that we can understand better what in fact happens when media connects with these incredibly important and powerful forces of identity, of nation, of political independence, of republicanism, and so on. That's a long, complicated but wonderful story, speaking as an Irish person myself, although I don't sound much like it. So let's first start with your, let's say, and we'll get back to this later, Louis, your identity as a poet. And let's fully immerse ourselves in this notion of who you are by hearing you read something in the Irish language and then read it for us again in English, and then that'll fully equip us to move on to something that will embody some of the challenges that we have to face in trying to understand media and Ireland and media theory.
Sure. I might actually read an Australian poem. It's called Didgeridoo, and it's quite a political poem, I suppose, and it speaks to the experience of being Irish and white in Australia and becoming conscious of the extent to which your being there comes about historically because of the dispossession of native people, but also being aware that the relationship between Irish and Aboriginal people right from the time of first white settlement in Australia is ambivalent, that the Irish are on both sides. There's evidence of intermarriage between Irish men and Aboriginal women, and on the other side there's also evidence of the Irish being involved directly in, I suppose, the attempted genocide of the native population. So something of that ambivalence perhaps is in the poem Didgeridoo. Ní bhealach an ceol seo nach ar ní a níos as íochtar cishán do bhuilig le brothal seanama na mro ann teo chreasach. Ní chuir sé do chos cheanarcach a step rink ar leach gan buchas de daigen a cheartaseach le sprong thais na gasfort cehach. Má hasan tú gan chur ar fa second amháin ó míle blian, chuir sé alta le réan a neadú I measc na guach I de chléan old caum, paróidí gorama, glasa, dearaga do huilí luiscithe is cucabora nigóideach a fanóid fé de chosa geala. Beg trevan ár san éir a cletarnach timpelort a lauert leat de méil rá ná tigan de chrí gaulghailach bán. Má hasan tú rá chiad blian a géistecht, cloisir ceol stair a chinne sile as onahar paulta, géir gobba éan na knaga pléas ka snappa mion chnáv, agus dór na geala ar sínsir knasta, a búla chrecin na talún mar a bheith bórán ná mohían faic. The English translation. This music is not played to lure a snake from the woven basket of your distended belly with a heat wave of torrid notes and swooning melodies. It won't set your rebel foot tapping on stone to taunt your straight-jacketed intellect with squalls of hornpipes and twisting slides. If you stand and listen for a second or 1,000 years, lyrebirds will nest in the devious loops of your branching hair. Blue, green and red parrots will perch on your scalded shoulders, and a sarcastic kookaburra make fun of your scorched white feet. You'll hear parakeets and lorikeets flutter round your head ancient tribes of the air speaking a language your wild colonial heart cannot comprehend. If you can stand for a minute or 200 years, you'll hear the songs of his people bleed from a punctured lung, sharp beaks pecking skulls, snapping small bones, while the bright fists of our gentle ancestors beat the skin of the earth like a bowron that feels nothing.
Beautiful. Thank you. The resonance, of course, with me connects with my home country, with Australia, but also with an understanding of the important role that media plays in, and has played in, bringing the question of Indigenous struggles into public discourse. And the important point, I guess, in relation to that moment of struggle for Indigenous people in Australia connects with the moment of many ongoing struggles in Ireland of, well, I guess we call Irish people Indigenous too, don't we? And how media has played a very important part in that.
Yeah. And there's an interesting idea at the heart of this, which is that in Ireland, certainly when I was growing up, there was this idea that poetry and politics didn't mix.
Right.
That even good politics made bad poetry. It became rhetorical and bombastic. There's this idea that Yeats has. He says that out of the struggle with others, we make politics. Out of the struggle with ourselves, we make poetry. And probably because of the long shadow cast by Ireland's revolutionary history, and particularly the troubles in Northern Ireland, there was this idea that poetry should be unaligned somehow. And it seems to me that that disabled a central element in poetry, which is also central to our understanding of media, the idea that bearing witness is partly what poetry is about, that an aesthetic that refuses commitment and engagement is a disabling of the form, whether it's the form of a newspaper or the form of a poem. And I'm certainly writing consciously against that idea that poetry should be located only in the silence of libraries or in the hush of a church, rather than being on the hustings as well. Now, I understand the dangers of that, but I think that poetry has become more and more marginalised as certain forms of media have taken centre stage in terms of how we process the overload of information from so many disparate sources. And the absence of poetry from the principal media outlets, both in Ireland, Australia, and here in the United States. I lived, I think, for about 4 months in New York, and during that whole time, not only was there not a single poem in the New York Times, except perhaps in one of its colour fashion supplements, there wasn't a single book review of a collection of poetry. And that's reflected elsewhere. So if we go back to the history of poetry in most countries, it was always one of the ways in which we speak back to power, one of the ways in which we process and try to come to understand our position in the world. And I always like to say to students in workshops and all the rest of it, you know, it's not coincidental that people in extreme situations turn to poetry. People in prison turn to poetry. People at death's door, people about to be executed, including the leaders of the 1916 Rising. If we look at what they wrote the night before they died, some of them wrote poems. So there's this urgency about the way poetry uses language in its relationship to the world, and by not allowing that particular form of understanding to be part of how we mediate the world, it seems to me that we not only disable poetry, but we exclude from our own humanity one of the many ways in which we need rhetorically to understand the world we're in. And increasingly, I think people are discovering that even if you place cameras and microphones at the center of the most awful things that are happening and present it as if it was somehow unmediated, there's still something missing from the way in which we deal with the atrocious things that are happening in our name right across the world.
I was going to ask you a question about how we don't spend enough time with not only poetry but literature, and how so much of our interest in, I suppose, deeper understandings and reflections on not only what it means to be human, but how to intervene in the world to make it more human, that sort of political project, has really been both subverted and replaced by vast amounts of media that doesn't really address, as you were suggesting, the key kinds of questions that poetry and I would suggest some forms of literature actually gives us, and so we're kind of alienating ourselves.
Yeah. So there's a refusal of complexity, linguistic complexity and intellectual complexity. That's one part of that. But I actually think it's more than a reluctance to engage with something which might be challenging by virtue of the way it presents itself in language or because it's a complicated idea. I think actually that one of the things that's happened in the way language is deployed generally in the public arena now is that there's a refusal to acknowledge that when it comes to the most intractable ideas and the most intractable problems, ambivalence of one kind or another and contradiction is central to the human response. That it's not black and white, that it's not one side or the other, and more there's a preoccupation in the media when they're not completely aligned with one side or another. The more mainstream, established, respectable media, so-called, tries to give equal time to each side representing two positions that are opposite and incapable of reconciliation. But most human beings are conflicted. And one of the things that literature does is it speaks to those deeper interior conflicts in a way that it seems to me has a much greater reality than the idea that you're constantly being hectored and pilloried to say, which side are we on, boys, which side are we on? And you choose one or the other. So I think poetry, even more than fiction, speaks to contradiction. And that it's very difficult for media, however, to do that. You know, if you're setting up debates, there's the adversarial nature of it as well. And one way that the adversarial nature of even good media works is you give equal time to two sides as if they were both equally capable of telling the truth, or as if they were all liars. That seems to me to be the standard approach of the mainstream Irish media, is all of these people are telling lies to us all the time. So by attacking them all the time, and the other idea then is that what a vigorous journalist is trying to do is to try and get the person he or she is interrogating to slip up somewhere. And if somebody slips up, they're lying. And of course we know that's not the truth, right? It's the person with the perfectly prepared speech, the perfectly prepared soundbite that never stumbles. But more and more our politicians are sent to trainers who teach them how not to slip up. But the stumble is presumed to be a lie and is very often not the lie.
Right. And so I would suspect that from your insights there, we're really engaged, those of us who are in media studies, engaged in a project that's only half formed, in the sense in which we've tended to accept the dominant modality, which is, okay, this is one side, this is the other, and we wait for them to slip up, or we wait for we observe and engage with a form of politics that really doesn't do justice to the complexity of the issues, that's for sure.
That's my sense of it, certainly. And I also think that there's a failure there to satisfy the real desire people have for something a little bit more complicated. It may well be that not everybody's going to have the time to spend unraveling every single one of these complicated issues. But when it comes to the big ideas, I think that we're fed a diet that is easily consumed but ultimately doesn't satisfy the hunger for understanding. And I think back to the emergence of popular media, print media, almost entirely in the 19th century, which I'm not an expert on this, but as I understand it, worldwide it's connected to the rise of mass literacy, improved education opportunities. Well, in Ireland, the rise of mass literacy and the new print media, particularly newspapers, coincides with a revolutionary period in our history and a revolutionary optimism, if you like. And there's this extraordinary desire in the 19th century amongst people with limited education for whatever it is that the print media provided in those days. And what they actually provided was quite sophisticated, quite complicated. And it also included consideration of cultural and literary matters, not just politics. And that has continued right into the 20th century. There's an extraordinary appetite in Ireland for newspapers still, even in our own age. And it suggests that there's still a hunger that hasn't been satiated entirely by a very thin diet.
Yeah, a thin diet indeed. I want to change tack, if we can, a little bit to move to a, if you like, a content area within media which is very important, I think, maybe to Boston more than any other country, and that is the relationship of Boston to the Irish. Irish Catholics in particular, and the questions that are seem to me to be important to think about of how the Irish have struggled with their identity within what was a Protestant and Puritan-esque kind of city, and then made gains and become a well-established part of the city, and what that might tell us about the role of media, of communication in what might be characterised as a struggle in and of its own right. You know, what thoughts you have on that kind of thing and your observations as something of an outsider and yet still being here?
Yeah, it's a very interesting time to be discussing these questions because up until very recently, it was said by certain commentators in Ireland who would suffer from what Australians would call cultural cringe, who felt, why can't we grow up and simply be like everybody else and stop talking about ourselves all the time and obsessing about these ideas of identity and all of the rest of it? Why can't we be like other more settled peoples? And there was this idea that to try and establish what Irish identity was a reflection of our fraught history and a kind of a parochialism. And now we find right across the whole world there is this preoccupation with identity. In Britain, I remember in one of the columns in The Guardian, there was quite a sarcastic comment on what made the Scottish Scottish. And this was a kind of a looking down the nose attitude, and it said, oh, I know what it is, the journalist said, in Scotland they take salt with their porridge, not sugar, as if anything to do with the particularity of a national identity or some other kind of identity was as trivial as that, which is presuming, of course, that even that is trivial. In fact, Ireland might well be ahead of other countries in having had to wrestle with the inheritance of colonialism and establishing what were the key elements of its identity. The difficulty for Ireland is that Ireland in the 20th century simply took on the categories of identity that had been imposed by colonisation on it and flipped the values attached to those categories on their head. So rather than Ireland being seen as being inferior by virtue of being Catholic, traditional, rural and Irish speaking, now it was going to be superior by virtue of being Catholic, rural, traditional, Irish speaking. And that was deeply problematic because it flew in the face of reality, first of all, at a time when people were fleeing the countryside, abandoning the Irish language, modernising more rapidly than many other countries in the early 20th century, to the point where in the early 20th century you could say the only aspect of our stereotype of our own identity that was true was our allegiance to Catholicism, which in turn was problematic because it suggested somehow people of other faiths were less Irish. But when you look back, then you discover that, of course, that's where they got the model from. It was English and then British imperialism in Ireland that made Ireland abnormal by virtue of not being Protestant, modern, urban and English speaking. So that's what we've inherited, and we've struggled with that model right through the 20th century. But now I look right across the world and I see that right across Europe, in the United States of America, people are looking to discover, is there a stable basis for identity? And I teach a lot of courses in this area in Irish studies at home, and one of the things we try and encourage students to think of is that identity is not something, or at least not entirely something, that's inherited. It's something that's negotiated, discovered and created. But there's a difficulty there also because certain parts of our identity are non-negotiable, and it's to recognise the tension between the stable and the unstable elements, the creative elements of identity, and some other residue that's there that you still need to acknowledge somehow. And I actually think that as indeed with the resolution of the Northern Irish sectarian conflict, that other larger cultural and political units, we might as well call them countries, might learn something from how Ireland has struggled to reconcile its identity. It seems extraordinary to me that in the media at the moment there's so little attempt to discover how ultimately one of the most intractable problems in human history, and certainly in modern human history, in Northern Ireland on the streets of Belfast and elsewhere, how was reconciliation affected there, and how can we learn from that to discover how we might deal with other apparently intractable problems.
Right.
Nobody seems to want to know.
No, that's true, and I think the question of what role the media would play in that educative process of drawing a number of different views into one environment, that seems not only intractable, it seems at the moment quite almost impossible and difficult and extremely likely that the lines of demarcation, the boundaries will be more solidly built, and we live in an epoch of walls, both literally and it seems figuratively or metaphorically. So the question that comes to my mind really about how Ireland might be a different kind of model or offer different kinds of ways of thinking about this is the richness of literary life, the richness of those wonderful authors who maybe connect somehow with those questions that you were saying earlier, have been shut out of media, but in fact are still very present, it seems to me, in Irish culture.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking of the Becketts, the Joyces, and so on.
Well, Ireland, official Ireland, has a fraught relationship with its artists, performers, writers, with cultural workers of one kind or another. I mean, the state emerged out of a period of cultural nationalism where culture and politics were inextricably linked. When people took to the streets in 1916 and during the War of Independence, they were resisting colonial political rule, but they were resisting it on behalf of a sense of their own cultural difference. Not very long after the state was established, I think that unravelled to a considerable degree. It's much easier to embrace your writers during a revolutionary struggle when they're asserting your position against somebody else. But once the state is established as the principal source of authority, writers and artists are still going to be a critical element in the mix. And the state has a very troubled relationship. Ireland was subject to censorship for a considerable period of time, during which the best Irish writers were all censored, with the exception of James Joyce, remarkably. So literature was to be censored because a critical position was not to be encouraged, a critical position in relation to the state and in relation to the world. Fast forward into the late 20th century and you have the period of the Celtic Tiger, and suddenly the pinnacle of Ireland's achievement amongst actors, filmmakers and all the rest of it was somehow evidence of the extent to which our economy was flourishing, and weren't we great considering our history. And as soon as austerity kicked in, there was this attempt then on behalf of the state. First of all, funding gets cut to culture disproportionately to almost any other area, but the state wants culture to be deployed exclusively, it would seem, in the service of the economy. So even when writers are applying for funding, they must show how somehow their writing is to the benefit of the economy. We also see this in higher education and universities. Universities are increasingly being asked to calculate and predict the benefit to the economy that flows from the kind of critical thinking that was protected usually from economic considerations in universities worldwide historically. So, like I say, Ireland, official Ireland still has a problematic relationship. We're delighted, or official Ireland is delighted when we win Oscars, delighted when the state can come in behind the success of an individual artist, but it does very little to invest in the possibility of some future artist emerging that would bring credit to the state. And of course, writers and artists don't exist to bring credit to the state. They're usually involved in critiquing wherever the source of power is. It's an interesting moment in us in the United States to see how that's going to play out when traditionally we expect artists to be more likely to be left-wing than right-wing. They're in a very different position now than they were a couple of weeks ago. And it's evident amongst comedians and satirists in particular what happens when the person who's the principal target of your satire now represents the country.
Yes, yeah. Well, it seems to me that what you've suggested here is the role and the unique role of writers and artists to critically engage and to operate in an autonomous zone, as it were, outside of the state, while, and this will have to be our final point, while the importance of media and literature in Ireland is largely that it is funded by the state. And it's a very different model, as it is in Australia and other parts of the former Commonwealth, that there's a way of seeing the media as serving the public through having a state funding, and yet still needing the role of critics to survive. It's an interesting and complex state of affairs, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and so there's two very different models of the artist and maybe the journalist also. There's the idea of the journalist citizen and the artist citizen, but there's also the romantic idea of the wild man who's the artist. And of course you have that in journalism also, that he's a renegade and he's an outsider, he's a maverick, or she increasingly, but that they speak a different kind of truth. Now it seems to me that that has also disappeared, and now there's this idea of the embedded artist and the embedded journalist, and the wild men and women are no longer likely to get the kind of funding or even be tolerated the way they were previously. So I think for both journalists and artists you're moving into much more dangerous territory when your ability to be oppositional is compromised by the extent to which you depend so utterly on advertising revenue or state funding of one kind or another.
Is it a special place, or is there a special place for those of us in universities who are engaging in critical and theoretical work to continue to recognise the uniqueness of our position and our contribution?
I think universities and those who work within them are in a uniquely privileged position. We are powerful in ways that we are reluctant to acknowledge, and it seems to me that our institutions and those who lead our institutions have been extraordinarily meek in response to the new pressures they're coming under from governments and from other agencies, and the capacity for critical thinking that's right at the heart of the university system needs to be asserted now more than ever.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good call to action. Just to finish up, what's the relationship between the ongoing struggle for the Republican movement and poetry and literature in Ireland? It'll have to be about a 10-second answer. I know that's unfair, but where does that stand?
I don't think that literature is in the service of any particular idea, including the Republican one. And the Republican idea in Ireland has a fraught history. It has produced extraordinary writing, but it has also produced other far less laudable things. So I wouldn't think that poetry or literature generally, or the media, should ever be fully in the service of any one idea. It's the diversity of critical approaches that we look for in literature and increasingly, I think, in journalism.
Great. Well, Louis, thank you very much. It's been a delight to talk to you and to hear those views from, what do they call it, across the pond, as it were. So thank you. And that's it for another episode of Boston Media Theory. Until next time, this is Marcus Breen saying goodbye and good night, and keep up that good media work. Bye.